Hello, everyone. I am Bob Lingle of Off the Beaten Path Bookstore in Lakewood, New York, and this is the Weaponized Literacy Podcast. Over the past year, I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with investigative reporters, social activists, astrophysicists, philosophers, military veterans, and just plain old writers. We discuss life, death, and all of the things that happen in between. Our goal is to use the power of the written word to create a better understanding of the world around us and the people that live in it. We do this by reading with purpose, and we invite you to join in our effort to weaponize literacy. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our guest tonight spent his early years as the son of a diplomat in the Middle East and in Africa, which exposed him to many cultures, languages, and religions. Following his law studies and an initial academic career, he has spent the last 25 years working with governments and development institutions worldwide, focusing on economic development and political reform through financial literacy, political inclusion, and constitutional initiatives. He has worked with think tanks on novel constitutional models and anti-corruption and political reform initiatives. Over the past 10 years, he has helped monarchies as they consider ways to increase the democratic legitimization of their monarch systems. Daniel Levin is currently a member of the board of the Liechtenstein Foundation for State Governance. He is married with 2 children and lives outside New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Levin. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Your book, The Proof of Life, details the search of a missing French citizen, Paul Blocquart, in 2014. But in general, searching for missing people and hostage negotiations aren't your line of work. Can you explain to us what your job is currently, and is it the same thing that you were doing back in 2014?
It is. I run a European foundation, the one that you mentioned earlier. It was started by a head of state for the sake of working primarily in failed states or states in civil war, and try to lay the foundation for them to rebuild when the killing ends. So most of what we do is try to identify a group of 20, 30, maybe 50 young people from all the sides of the warring parties in the war, and either take them out of the country or train them within the country and prepare them for future leadership, political leadership, social leadership, educators, doctors, thinkers, really across all parts of society. So it's not just politicians, and get them ready so that when the killing does end, that the excuse for not changing isn't that there's no one else to do this. So that we actually have a crop of people who are able to step in, and we've been doing this for a long time, and that's the context, the setting for the events that we'll talk about that took place in the book. But that's very much still what we're doing. We're currently active in Libya and Yemen and other countries too.
How do you help identify those 20 or so people?
We start by asking the major power centers in the country to give us a group of candidates, and we then reserve the right to interview them and select those that we believe are either the most capable, or if possible, so those that we can get a sense might also be the least corruptible in the bunch. We try to have an even gender ratio. Our experience has been that the women, especially in countries with religious slants, I would say, tend to be a little more competent and less nepotistic in terms of how they're chosen. And so we try to keep that even too. It gets a little complicated in a country like Yemen, where you have 187 tribes, so you obviously can't appease everybody, but we really do try to spread. And in Syria, which was what we had done in 2012 and 2013, when the war had started, it wasn't clear at all that the regime would gain the upper hand. Everyone was motivated to help us mediate the war, and so as a condition for our efforts to mediate at the time, this was before the Russian involvement in 2015 when everything changed, as a condition for mediating, we asked each side to the war to give us 4 or 5 young, promising candidates that we could then train. So that's the context here, and that's how we do this.
Okay. So how did you end up getting involved in situations like the one detailed in your book, Proof of Life?
In Syria, as I mentioned, we started in 2012, 2013 with this initiative, and as a result of this work and network that we developed to all the sides in the war, it became known that we were pretty well connected there. And so there were a number of instances starting really in 2012 where we got approached by families, sometimes governments, of missing persons, and the same thing happened here in 2014. In fact, 2014 was a particular gruesome year. It was the year, if you recall, that journalists such as James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, Americans, were beheaded near Raqqa in the northeast of the country, within gruesome videos that made their way to YouTube. And it was very shortly after the execution of James Foley that I got approached again by this gentleman asking whether I could help. He had asked governments, intelligence agencies, and they refused to really be helpful, taking the position that the person who had wandered into Syria did it at his own risk, and they weren't going to use any financial or human capital to try and extricate him. And that's our approach then. I do want to correct one more thing is I do not identify the nationality of the missing person, but he wasn't French. I just want to make that clear.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was. I thought that just because of where the asking takes place in the beginning of the book for your help. So how did you acquire the skill sets, or how does one acquire the skill sets needed to navigate the dangerous terrain that you're experiencing?
I don't. I think we have to detach ourselves from some kind of romanticized view, some kind of a Jason Bourne or Jack Reacher kind of thinking. It's nothing like that at all. First of all, I grew up in the Middle East. I was born in Israel, served in the Israeli unit in combat, so I had some experience with the war dynamics and the war economics of the region. Even though nothing really ever prepares you for what happened in Syria, which is such a dimension way beyond the destruction that happens in war. And we can get into that later. So in that sense, there's no master class to take on hostage negotiations or anything like that. It just happened, and so this process, which I also describe in the book, is very much a process of understanding the relationships that you have, and also the relationships of those with whom you have a relationship, to see whether there is a web of favors and counter favors that you can work with. And then you do it in these, you sort of peel away the layers of an onion. You start by seeing who might be able to be helpful, who might have some information on the missing person. How do I get to that person? What would that person expect in return? And you work through all those layers. Then you try to get information on whether the person's alive and on who has the missing person, who's controlling him. And then obviously you work from there to trying to get proof of life, establishing that, which is a whole different step, because you need to have direct access to the missing person at that point. And then if you're lucky and you have proof of life and the person's alive, then you try to enter a negotiation for the release of that person, which, these are all very unlikely, complicated, and difficult scenarios. So it's the failure rate is very high. And in fact, in 2014, just before I was approached on this case, we had just had a really traumatic failure where I'd been asked by the family of a missing person to find him, and when I found him exactly at the same time that he was executed by his captors in Syria. And I do want to mention one more thing, which is that we have a broad misconception. There are few high-profile cases that get known, but there are way more young people whose disappearance is never made public. I'm currently aware of 14 Westerners, and with that I mean Americans, Canadians, and British citizens, who are being held just in Syria alone, whose names have never been made public for a whole host of reasons. So that's the context within with this. It's not some grand thing where I parachute in behind enemy lines and shoot my way into a prison or something like, silly like that. That's really for the movies. This is really more kind of really laborious, effortful work through people that you hope to know or know already, and then try to stay one step ahead of the people you're interacting with.
Does a lot of it have to do with the trust that you can build?
It's trust or leverage. I mean, it's nice to have trust. Even in my story, there's one very close friend of mine who helps me, whom I do trust entirely, also with my life. But beyond that, it's really trying to figure out what you have that the person that you need something from may want, whether that's a favor or a favor for someone else. It can be. There have been other instances, for example, where a Syrian captor had a sick mother who needed to go abroad for cancer treatment, but because this Syrian member of the regime was on sanctions and his family was on sanctions, she couldn't travel. So one of the ways to just get proof of life in that case on the missing person was to arrange for cancer treatment at a clinic in Germany, and in return, we got proof of life. So sometimes it's those kinds of favors. We obviously cannot pay ransom for missing people.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's illegal because you can't pay a terrorist group under U.S. law. It's illegal. Second of all, I wouldn't do it even if it were legal, because I really believe that for every person that you pay ransom, as tragic as those cases are, for everyone, every time you pay, you have 10 more people who are taken hostage just for the sake of ransom payments. So, it's one of those dirty little underbellies of these war economies.
On the topic of money, you had detailed that you don't accept any financial compensation for the work that you're doing. Can you give us some explanation on why that is?
Well, first of all, this kind of work, looking for missing people, is incidental to the work of our foundation. Our foundation is really, it's a non-for-profit foundation that's been capitalized and seeded by the founder, which is the reigning prince of Liechtenstein. It's a family foundation. It's politically completely neutral and independent from their government or any other government. We do a lot of track 3 diplomacy, where we negotiate between countries that officially don't talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to be able to be credible, the first thing you have to do is to be independent. And the first level of independence, not political independence, but it's rather financial independence, that everyone knows that you're not being compensated by any one side to that. So as a matter of principle, already the foundation doesn't accept payments for this kind of work. And then on top of that, in the context of hostages, you have to make it absolutely clear that money just doesn't change hands. The moment you open up to any kind of compensation, even if it's travel reimbursements, the rumor starts to spread that you've accepted money for it. As it is, rumors spread even when you don't accept money, and I talk about that in the book. And someone threatens with starting a false rumor about me just for the sake of intimidating me. But it's much easier to be able to say I didn't take anything, not directly, not indirectly. No one paid for a trip, for a cup of coffee, or for anything else. So that also I don't get demands from other people to share some of those funds. So it really is. Life gets a lot easier. It's already a pretty complicated existence, but it gets a lot easier if you can just categorically slam the door and say there's just literally the question of money is not one that comes up. So I try to avoid even being invited for meals in connection with this kind of work.
And just to reiterate, this work is separate from the work of your foundation. Do you get any sort of grief from the foundation of, hey, why are you getting involved in these situations? Does it complicate anything in regards to your work?
No, not really. The foundation and the board, the family members of the founders, as well as all of our staffers, are completely in this. In other words, for example, if we're looking for a missing person in a country, my staff will get involved in putting background information on the person, on the families, on the groups that may be holding him, understanding travel patterns. So the staff is fully in this. So when I say it's separate, it's part of the foundation's work. It's just incidental to the foundation's activity. And I view it more, the foundation does officially, and we say this on the website of the foundation, we do get involved in mediation between warring sides, either within a conflict or between countries that are in a hostile predicament. And so it's really an incidental aspect to that kind of work, but it's very germane to the foundation's work. So and the staff and the foundation board is fully on board, no pun intended, on this kind of work.
I was just going to make a note. Anyone watching on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, you can feel free to use the comment section on any of those platforms to ask any questions. Kelly didn't have a question, but she would love a copy of the book. You know where to find one. We have one in stock here at the store. You had talked about not wanting to romanticize the work that you're doing or kind of inflate the level of danger that you're in, but just the situations that you're in and the people that you're talking to, there is a level of danger to it. And as a father myself, you're married and have two children. Does your family get concerned with the work that you're doing? And how does having a family impact some of the decisions that you might make along the way?
At many levels. My wife and I have a pretty clear understanding. She, by trade, is a profession, so I never asked about the people that she talks to, and she doesn't ask about certain aspects of what I do, but she understands what I do. She did learn about this particular these events that I described that took place in 2014. She learned about them when I gave her the first draft of the manuscript to read. So we do keep it separate. Of course, I do try to I try to do everything to keep myself safe, and I manage, I think, for the most part. Even in connection with this story, when I have to spend a night in Beirut going dark without cell phones or anything else, but I'm doing it because I know that the person who arranged for that is someone I completely trust. So I really do feel safe. I try to avoid risks I shouldn't take. The thing that's a little bit harder, because you're asking about children,
Mm-hmm.
is that, for example, you take this story now. There are two little girls. They're young girls at the time that I meet. The younger of the two is the age of my daughter. My daughter's today 22, but all these things took place 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the older one's 2 years older. She's now 24, and it really breaks your heart. These were two young girls in this story. Two young girls who had been taken from their villages in Syria, from the village in Syria, and sold into sex slavery in the Gulf. And so the heartbreaking part, especially when you're dealing with war zones, I talk about another young man a Syrian boy who had been adopted by a Jordanian family who had been just suffered the most horrendous trauma and burnt beyond recognition. And so what really breaks your heart is when you're watching children who are victims of this war in any way, whether it's, again, young girls sold into sex slavery or just children who have suffered terrible traumas and injuries and been orphaned. So that's where you sort of walk away thinking, but by the grace of God go I, or my children, or my family, and those are the harder things. But that's a part of my work. That's just as true as the development work I used to do in Africa in the 90s, where I remember the first trip I took in 1999 after my daughter was born was back to Nigeria on a project that we did, and driving in from the airport where I saw little children emerge at 7 in the morning from sewage pipes. And it just, for the first time, I'd internalized it. Now I had my own daughter, my own infant back at home. So it's that kind of an experience that I think is harder. It's not so much really the danger. I mean, I believe I can control them. There's certain things I just refuse to do. So if someone tells me you have to go to the northeast of Syria near the Iraqi border to negotiate something, I simply can't make that trip. It's simply not safe enough for me to do that, and I have to figure out another way to establish that communication. So just in terms of my own personal safety, I believe it's something I can manage. The harder part is the emotional part, what you're witnessing, obviously, in war zones.
Well, on the topic of kids changing the dynamic, obviously the Middle East is just constantly in the news, but it wasn't until the news of the young boy that drowned in 2015 that was all over the news, that like the situation in Syria just kind of tore me apart. I remember probably should have been working at the time when I was at my old job, and scrolling through the news instead, and just seeing that image of that boy washed up on shore just tore me apart. So I can't imagine experiencing it firsthand, just the way it impacted me from a news article. And it serves as a kind of a segue. You had, the book is about the search for Paul, but the reason for the book wasn't to tell Paul's story. It was for those two girls that you had referenced earlier. Can you go into more detail of how you encountered them and their situation?
Yeah, I'll give a quick, a run through the plot without providing any spoilers, obviously. So I get asked to see if I can find any information about this missing person. Someone approaches me, or someone talks to me in Paris, asks me for a meeting in Paris. We go for a long walk. He breaks down and tells me about this young man who had gone missing, whom he cares about. It was the son of a close friend of his. And the first thing I do is talk to a friend of mine called Khalid Al-Mari, who is a Saudi citizen, very connected in the region, who has helped with other hostage situations. In fact, there are 5 Americans who are alive today, thanks only to Khalid Al-Mari. It's his real name also. And he then says, listen, if you want to get some information here, you're going to have to come meet me in Istanbul, and then be prepared to fly to Beirut, because there's a very prominent Lebanese militia leader, a very well-known person. Someone is on the U.S. sanctions list. But if you're going to get further into this, you're probably going to have to go through him. He's going to have to vet you and agree to provide you information that you're going to need. So that's what ends up happening. I go to Istanbul, from there to Beirut, spend a night with this person whom I had to give a pseudonym to, but in the footnotes it's very clear who he is. Whoever understands the region will know that. I call him the sheikh in the book. And that sends me off on a chase to Jordan, to Amman. Essentially, it becomes clear that the group that at some point had possession of this missing person is one of the largest drug gangs in Syria that manufactures and exports this very insidious amphetamine called Captagon all over the world, but in particular into the Gulf, into the Arabian or Persian Gulf, and in particular into Saudi Arabia, where there's massive addiction. And so I end up having to catch up with the gang and then with the ringleader from Jordan all the way to Dubai. And it turns out that this group is not only the largest Captagon drug manufacturer and exporter, but they also specialize in trading in human beings, both in hostages and in young children that they kidnap and take from small villages in Syria and then sell into sex slavery into the Gulf, into Dubai, into Saudi Arabia. And as I'm looking for this ringleader, I'm told by his former wife, whom I have a way to connect to. I'm told by his former wife that he hangs out in a particular place in a bar where some of these young girls are being essentially sold off. And I go to that bar, and bar is a very polite way of describing that establishment. And I go into there, and as I walk in, there is or actually as I'm trying to leave, because it's so extremely loud and I don't see the guy there, so I try to leave, and there is a scene that blocks my path, which is a man dragging a young girl, really very young girl, a teenager, by her hair on the floor, and she's screaming in agony, and I end up in a fight with this person because he's just blocking my way out. And it turns out that this is one of those two young girls. I then leave the place after this. Actually, I'm kicked out of the establishment, and I go to grab a cab back to the hotel just to calm my mind. And her sister, who's 2 years older, who's today 24 years old, but this took place 7 years ago. She's 17 at the time. She comes up to me, runs up to me, and wants to thank me for helping her sister. And we end up talking, and she tells me her story, and it turns out that she was taken by the same drug lord who had information on the missing person. And she ends up, and I describe this in the book, actually helping me tremendously finally make contact with this drug lord, and takes a huge personal risk. And towards the end of the book, when I ask her what I can do for her in return, she says that she doesn't want to be just a statistic of this war, and she wants to be remembered. So if I want to do anything for her, I should tell her story. And so really the main reason that I wrote this book was as out of promise that I made to her and to her sister then.
And I also don't want to offer any spoilers, but the book doesn't have the happiest of endings, but it's not totally devoid of hope. After all of that, of everything that you've experienced throughout all of your work, pure evil in some of the circumstances that you've been in, where do you find hope throughout your work?
I don't want to be trite and just say, that you find kindness in a sea of evil and all that. I mean, I think those are all sentences that get overused.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel that it's not just there, but by the grace of God go I, in the sense that, I wasn't born into a war zone or with a debilitating disease or anything like that. So we should just be grateful for it. It's also that war does strange things to people, and war economies do strange things to people. And that doesn't mean that I find evil always excusable based on the context. But when I'm grateful, I'm also grateful that I wasn't tested that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a wonderful biblical story of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And one day King David is frustrated that he isn't considered one of the three patriarchs and challenges God why he isn't. And God's answer to King David, this is a Kabbalistic, mystical kind of interpretation. God's answer to him is, that's because they were tested and you weren't. And then King David's response is, well, then test me. So the Old Testament the writes about this. Sorry, the prophets write about that. And of course, that's where he failed the test. You never ask for a test that you're not sure that you can pass. And so I feel that way about this, which is I'm very careful to call something evil. Of course, you encounter evil, and men who go and grab little girls from villages and sell them into slavery, or people who just execute people just for the sake of it, or as a recruiting tool, like ISIS does, as an example, or the unspeakable cruelty that the Syrian regime has exhibited towards its own people. It is evil, and it's okay to call it evil, of course, but uh, what does humble me in this context are the instances of people who do things without craving the public recognition the whole time. I think we've come accustomed, and I don't want to make this a social media discussion, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly social media has accelerated or inflamed this trend, is that people don't do things quietly anymore. If someone does something good, everyone has to know about it. If someone donates, they have to be splashed all over the whatever pages, publications of the place they've donated to. People need to get awards and medals and so on. And so what it was very humbling, and happened very much in the course of this the events that I described, and also generally my work, is running into people who do good things really just because they believe they're the right things to do, and don't expect anything in return, don't want to be thanked, don't want to be praised, they don't blast their pictures on Instagram or anything else. It's really just, and those are the most humbling, those sort of quiet, modest kind of acts. And first of all, without people like that, there is no way for me to do the work that I do. There's no way I can ever have even shreds of any success in these kinds of instances, because it's luck alone is not going to get me there. And certainly this is not a question of brilliant advanced planning. You really do need those kinds of contributions. So those are the people who really keep me going.
And just based on your experience and your knowledge of the area, I did want to take a break from the book and get your thoughts on the current situation with Afghanistan.
Yeah, Afghanistan, it's super easy to do the usual punditry stuff and say that Biden moved out too quickly and that it wasn't well planned, and then you're going to get the right left divide. Whoever is not in power is going to attack this, and whoever is in power is going to defend it. So I don't want to get too bogged down in that. I'm so worn out from the last few years in American politics that I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that the whole tribal kind of Pavlovian reflex, that you ring a bell and the dog foams from the mouth kind of thing. I don't want to. I don't do that. I don't think that's very productive. I think the whole concept in Afghanistan was so misguided. First of all, starting with the idea that we need to send troops there to teach Afghans how to fight is so ridiculous. The one thing you really don't need to teach Afghans how to do is how to fight. Same thing with Yemen. Every child learns how to fight there. And so what Afghanistan is a complete failure of governance, right? This arrogance that we go somewhere and think not only again that we can teach someone how to fight who doesn't need lessons in that, but also the idea that we can export our political systems and just do a copy paste of how we do things in the West, and not just America, but England, France, whatever, um, is so absurd when you're going into countries and societies that are structured completely different, whether it's for tribal reasons. And it's not that we're not tribal; we just have two particular tribes right now in the U.S. But in our own very particular political system, with God knows its own pathologies, we shouldn't be really in the business of lecturing anyone how to run a country. But no one ever tried to build proper institutions. It was really always, again, that game of betting on a particular person, whether that was Karzai at the time or Ghani later, a different president. And so it's that same thing that you're always betting on someone with their thinking, this delusion that you actually can know a person, how they behave, when in fact human beings are awful prognosticators. We're terrible predictors. I don't think that we need to wait for any more evidence about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the failure in Afghanistan was, rather than betting on a particular person, a group of people who ended up being just as corrupt as their predecessors, it was the failure over these 20 years not to build proper institutions, to rethink the country and say, well, Afghanistan is in fact an enormous country with some areas that are nomadic, some areas that are inaccessible, to rethink the system and decentralize it and have rotation governments and power sharing governments, and think about how you can, for example, incorporate Sharia law, Islam, into a legal structure. There are plenty of examples of countries that have combined secular and religious legal systems. You can have religious law govern certain aspects of family law. We may not like that. We may believe that that offends our views of equality, gender equality, for example. And I understand that, but we're also not the ones living there grew up in that culture. So there's a lack of humility in how we go about those countries. And this is before we even get into the whole point of Afghanistan, just because the Taliban at the time were hosting and protecting Osama bin Laden in 9/11. And that's a whole different discussion for another day, and whether that made any sense, just like the Iraq War did, which gave us ISIS and strengthened Iran. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously you can hear my bias from my answers, but it's hard for me to talk about Afghanistan and just focus on the pullout. Was it too fast? Yeah, it was too fast, and is it unfortunate that American weapons fell into the hands of the Taliban? Yeah, of course it was unfortunate. But what happened now is also an intelligence breakdown. The fact that just a few months ago, U.S. intelligence agencies thought that the current government would have at least 2 to 3 years to stay in power. Which again, you look at this and say, I'm not entirely sure what this intelligence assessment was based on. Um, but it's always based on a lack of, and I don't mean intelligence. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but it's a lack of actual penetration. It's the same thing that happened in 2010 and 11 with the Arab Spring, starting in Tunisia and sweeping across North Africa and into the Middle East and Syria, which is that you can send all the ambassadors you want into a country, if all they do is meet with other ambassadors in the Capital Club and the Diplomat Club and sip gin and tonics, and I'm not trying to be facetious here, even though I know it sounds that way, but unless you're penetrating those societies, you go to Egypt, you better start establishing contacts, let's say, with the Muslim Brotherhood. If you don't do that and you just interact with those in powers, you're never really going to have the ability to get a deep feel for that society. That's why also our foundation doesn't spend any time dealing government to government in those places. We really go and try to penetrate civil society, try to go to schools, try to go even to religious schools, madrasas in cases of Muslim religious countries, and try to recruit people from there, because those are the ones who are going to have to build those societies and build them in their own mode. And when we work with them, we don't provide them a Swiss model or an American model or anything else. We provide them with what we believe are good practices, and then work with them to form their own structures, what makes sense there. And those structures may not be ones that I like,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also not the one growing up in that culture who has to make those choices. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, it's easier to answer your Afghanistan question from that, because there was an entire absence of that, very little. Even our development agency, if you're talking from a U.S. perspective, the USAID, the Agency for International Development, is part of the State Department. So its missions are defined by the U.S. government's mission, right? The State Department obviously goes where the White House goes. And so, again, you have politicized your mission statements already, and it's very hard to actually penetrate the society on the ground and do that. And if you're going to just cede that ground to NGOs who are working there, you're not going to be successful. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not only a waste of resources, it basically perpetuates the ill. I mean, anybody who has observed Afghanistan, who thought that you can engage with the Taliban, which is what the Trump administration was trying to do, and the Obama administration prior to that, um, forgot what Maya Angelou said, which is, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I know that the usual punditry and the usual articles talk about this being, the same as the departure of Saigon and people holding on to planes, and it's another Vietnam. I don't think that's true. I think it's really different from Vietnam. But you can't forensically analyze Afghanistan if you're not willing to go a little bit deeper than just focusing on the departure right now.
And thank you for all of that. I didn't want the punditry, so that's why I was asking somebody who could give us something a bit deeper. Through our virtual events, just from the American aspect of things, we've talked to Eric Edstrom, who's an Afghanistan veteran, who wrote On American. Jeff Danziger, recently we spoke with him, who's a nationally syndicated political cartoonist and a Vietnam veteran. In both of those conversations, we kind of reached the same unfortunate conclusion that unless we can find a way for war to be so profitable for people, we're just going to have to get used to the fact that war will continue. I had listened to one of your previous interviews, and you kind of went into that just with the drug and human trafficking trade from that end. What are your thoughts in terms of kind of the military industrial complex? Is that so much a factor there, or is it just a bit more chaotic than that?
Yeah, I think if you focus the military-industrial complex, it may be a little too narrow, actually. In other words, yes, of course, the industry of weapons productions and everything around that, and its weapons, its uniforms, it's everything else, obviously sustains it. And as long as we're going to export weapons into war zones, there's going to be killing in war zones. So I think that's obvious, and doesn't, and, there's nothing I can really add to that because
Mm,
it's been discussed a lot. And it's been part of political campaigns. Bernie Sanders talks about it a lot too. So I have nothing to add to that. I think if you go, let's take a look at Syria because that's the topic of the book. So you could take any war you wanted to, but Syria is an extremely helpful example. First of all, it's a country that now has been broken into what we consider sectarian camps, even though that's really odd in Syria, because Syria, even though it had a minority Alawite Shiite government, the Assad family, the reason for that is actually go back to colonial times. Both the British and the French, as colonial powers, had perfected the art of choosing a minority group in a country, and they did this in all the colonies in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, where they would choose a minority group and put them in power, knowing full well they'd be so hated by the majority of the population that they would require the colonial powers, continued support to stay in power.
mm,
And so you created this dependency. And so that's exactly what you're watching in Syria, right? This Alawi group, even though they came to power in Hafez al-Assad in a coup, it's still this minority group in the colonial pattern here that you're seeing. Now, what has happened in Syria is now suddenly people talk about Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds and Christians that hate each other. That was never the case. Syria is not Iraq. Iraq is a country that in this form really shouldn't exist. It's three countries, the Kurdish, the Sunni, and the Shia part. That wasn't the case. I've been to Syria many times before the war. No one ever asked whether I'm Jewish or Christian or Sunni or Shia, and I speak Arabic with their accents, so no one really cared. Syria was one of those places it really didn't matter. Now, uh, when you get into the war economy, suddenly you have these tribes that open up that make money on this war that keep it alive. And the reason I mentioned the history of Syria is there's no natural reason for these hostilities. You can argue in Iraq that the country is so bifurcated or trifurcated that the war is almost a natural consequence. I don't believe that there either, but at least you can make that argument. In Syria, there's no reason for this war other than the fact that a very few people have become stupendously wealthy in that war.
mm,
And as long as they can continue to remain and become even more stupendously wealthy, that war will continue basically until they run out of people. Because Syria is devastated completely. 10 years ago, Assad says to his people, you either get me or I burn the country to the ground. And in the end, the people got both. He
mm,
stayed and the country got burned to the ground. It's so completely devastated. You're not even sure what they're fighting over. Since Russia got involved in 2015 and together with the Iranian support for the regime, the war tilted, basically in the regime's favor. They're not going to be pushed out by war anymore. So the reason the killing is continuing, the war is continuing now, is really just because of the war economy. It's an amazing ground for drug trade, for people's trade. Everything that you sell into Libya, the very few people, we're talking about a handful of families. If you want to sell diesel fuel, or if you want to sell uh, uh, blankets or clean water or medicine or now vaccines in the pandemic, or of
mm,
course, if drugs and chemical weapons and human beings, the few who make money on that and continue to profit that way can keep this war alive. And as long as that's the case, this war economy, that's going to continue.
mm,
Now, that also means inversely, if you want to end these wars, you have to end these war economies. And that's not just about ending the drug trade, because as we know from our own situation with the drug trade, whether it's drugs coming from Central and South America, or whether it's drugs we know full well how to manufacture ourselves with our own opiate crisis, if you don't if you cannot impact the huge market, meaning the demand side of it, you're not going to end the supply side of it. There's no mystery in that. In the case of a war economy, if we're just looking at the military industrial complex, we're looking at it too narrow. For example, the drug trade, I talk about the Captagon trade, produces billions and billions in annual profits in cash every year,
mm,
billions. And the margins are so large that the people who are making the money are profiting billions. In other words, the revenues is tens of billions and the profits are tens of billions because it's so cheap to manufacture and trade these drugs. Now, those are cash sums that get taken physically out of the country, moved into warehouses, in the region, in Southeast Asia. I myself, with my own eyes, have seen a cash warehouse in Jakarta, in Indonesia, with Gaddafi funds, with a warehouse that hosts billions and billions in cash in containers, each container containing about $25 million in cash.
Wow.
Containers, imagine a container that you see at airports sometimes that are being used in freight transportation, right? Full of cash. Now that cash gets pushed into the interbank the system, the SWIFT system, what we call the SWIFT system. Now you have top banks, okay, blue chip banks, publicly traded banks in the world that are part of this trade, that allow for the cash despite money laundering rules, despite being members of the so-called Egmont Group for financial intelligence units trying to prevent this, who launder these funds for 30-40% fees. So in other words, you walk into a bank with $100 million in cash, they put 70 million of it into the SWIFT system where it gets anonymized. This has been taken on a whole new dimension now with cryptocurrencies based on blockchain technology that can be completely anonymized. So now there's no way to trace who the beneficial owners are and who the perpetrators are. If you allow for financial institutions, just to give you one example, to be part of this war economy where they make these huge sums based on that, right? And you still have enough economies in the world that are entirely cash-based, sometimes as a result of U.S. sanctions, such as the Russian economy, which is so much dollar cash-based as a result of Russian sanctions, where Russian banks can't join the financial system. When that happens, you keep these wars alive by that too. So it's not just a matter of how do we stop the drug trade, how do we stop selling weapons into them. First of all, we don't stop because there's always someone willing to do it. And second of all, as long as the profits from these wars can make their ways into the financial system and get laundered that easily and as easily today as 50 years ago, it's very, very difficult. So I think when you were talking about, Afghanistan war veterans or Vietnam war veterans expressing the frustration about these war economies, these angles are very much part of it too. And if you don't disrupt this and disrupt it with real political will, and this is something that one country can't do alone, but really countries have to work together. If you can't do that, there's very little chance of ending these wars. And obviously, we've already shown, humanity has shown, I think, pretty definitively that we don't have the capacity for the kind of empathy that in itself is going to end the wars.
I unfortunately agree with with you on that one. But there, at the end of the book, and it was when I was listening to it, it was why I'm like, I need to talk to this guy. It was you kind of rehashing the conversation that you have with people so frequently of, why do you keep doing this? Nothing's going to change. Who cares? And then you list very specifically and in great detail the number of people that care. So is it the human element and your empathy that are driving you to keep doing the work that you're doing?
It's hard. I'm not trying not to give you a sappy answer to that, where
I'll allow it.
No, it's because I think it sounds much self-aggrandizing. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I didn't get pulled into this because I decided I want to make a contribution to humanity. It really was something that evolved as a result of my work, which I think, of course, the development aspect of the work of the foundation interested me, but it was also the academic part of it, of trying to develop systems for war zones and figure out that it was also, I felt like, an intellectual challenge. So it wouldn't be true for me to say, I'm really trying to appeal to my better angels and try to follow that, but that's just not true. It just evolved that way. Once you're pulled into it, especially when the family's involved, it's very, very difficult to say no. And it's a little bit absurd because you might spend a lot of time and resources, my own resources, in trying to even just find out what happened to a missing person. And often a person who took on these risks on their own, there's a little bit of anger in me sometimes when I learn of people who took on crazy risks and marched into a war zone for the sake of a career that they hoped would emanate from that. And then when they get snatched, then first of all, their families suffer the most unbelievable agony, in fear and anguish and anxiety, and often, of course, are crushed when they find that their loved ones are killed. And so there's a bit of anger towards those people too. But there's also this bizarre kind of absurd sense that I get sometimes when you find yourself, let's say, in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen, and you're trying to help one Westerner, even just get information in or get the person out. It's usually him, though in some cases, for example, in the case of Syria, in the case of an American called Kayla Muller, who was killed by, was held by the head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, and killed by them also. So sometimes it's women too, and there's certainly huge amounts of women who are victims in this war. But when you get involved in it, you feel that it's so silly essentially, because for one person you might help, if you're lucky, you're watching these thousands and thousands who are being destroyed, and you might be able to help someone, and yet you're not. So it's the same thing with trying to help people, refugees. You might help one, but you're really not making a dent in this flood of refugees that is coming our way. So all I can do for myself is focus on being happy with what I'm doing, right? That I can look in the mirror of what I'm doing in particular, with one particular person, one particular life. But if I try to put this in a larger context, it's very hard not to lose faith in humanity, and it's also hard to find any meaning in this kind of activity because it really doesn't make a larger difference. So um, it would be wrong to say that I think it does make a difference. It makes a difference for one person only. In a larger context, maybe my time would be better spent trying to disrupt, for example, these war economies. And there's some wonderful people, investigative journalists, who are doing just that, who are really trying to shine a light on this ugly, ugly underbelly of these wars, and all the people are profiteering. And it's not always these cartoonish killers like some of the guys I described in my book. This guy Nasser really looks like a cartoonish guy who like works out and takes steroids. I mean, he's everything that you can imagine of a villain. He really looks that way also. But it's not those. Sometimes it's the accountant. Sometimes it's the lawyer who figures out the trust structure to hide the beneficial owners of these accounts, which originate in these. For every drug lord, there's some financial service professionals, the legal professionals, and other helpers who are helping them. And so, unless we find a way to disrupt all that, that would have a much bigger impact. And I've interacted with doctors who take huge personal risks and try to work on a field hospital in the war zone, and whether it's there or whether it's doctors in Africa who work with children who've stepped in landmines, those are the ones who deserve really our respect. They're not sitting in a comfortable home, and the same way you and I are having a conversation right now, but really sacrifice a lot. So in terms of having an impact on a larger group of people, I think that we should reserve our admiration for those folks.
The investigative journalists that are looking into those, do they have publications out now that we could look up? I just want to Google some names if you have.
There are, and if you look at first of all, there's the Journalists Without Borders, which mirrors the Doctors Without Borders. There are on my author's website, I have a book group talking points, suggestions, the PDF that can be downloaded on the website there. And in it, at the end of it, there are also suggestions of organizations that help journalists and doctors and others who help people in need in these war zones. So if people want to get a sense of whom to support and who to look into, but it's even people who made public the Panama Papers, which was, as you know, this huge trove of this law firm in Panama, Mossack Fonseca, that basically had all these huge trust structures and these ways of anonymizing illegal funds all over the world, from funds that paid for the construction of Vladimir Putin's palaces in the Black Sea to drug lords to others. So, and they take huge personal risks in doing that. I really do believe that, and I have nothing but admiration for journalists who do that. And there were journalists in Syria and in other war areas who pay the ultimate price. I deal now with families of journalists who are in harm's way or are held against their will or held hostage in places because they're really trying to shine a light. It's an extremely courageous profession. So there's no shortage of groups we can support and admire when it comes to that.
And your website is daniellevinauthor.com?
That's correct.
All right, I will put that in the comment section so people can check out the the resources that you have there. And then, what do you hope readers take away from your book? If there was just one or two things.
There are two things I would say. One is I really wanted them. I describe it as having someone holding my head underwater for those 20 days and living through that. And I was hoping a reader would experience it. We don't have a general draft in the U.S. I think most people haven't experienced war themselves, and even those who have been in war and combat may have not have experienced. Hopefully, not for them, these types of horrors that you see in Syria. So I want a reader to understand just how these things take place, and anything that we can do, whether it's the way we behave politically or socially, to try to make even a small dent, or even support groups that are trying to help in these kinds of situations. And then on a deeper, more personal level, I said this earlier, I think the sensation of how fortunate we are, there, but by the grace of God go I, that type of, but by the grace of the good luck of where I was born. This is not a religious statement, obviously, so this works for agnostics too. But the idea that perhaps we should be a little careful with taking what we have for granted. The last few years have brought this really ugly tribalism to the forefront, irrespective of where someone stands politically. I don't think any fair-minded person could argue that we're not at each other's throats in our country, that we're just broken down into tribes, and that no matter what, the other tribe is evil, and someone who doesn't disagree with us can't just simply disagree with us. The person has not only to be wrong, but has to be evil and bad at that moment. And when that starts, these types of zero-sum tribalisms, it ends up in a place like Syria, and we shouldn't take for granted what we have. And so if someone wants to take anything from the book, that's what I take from these kinds of experiences, is that kind of fortune and how very easily things can go wrong. And they really can descend very, very quickly. And this is not about January 6th and the events in Washington. It goes way beyond that. It's now we've reached a place where we can't even talk to someone who has different kinds of views, even different kinds of attires. Now, whether someone plants an American flag in the garden can be either a source of support if you're in that tribe, or a source of scorn if you're not in that tribe. When we reach that place, we're not quite as far from these types of wars as we may think. And it's odd that we even harbor that delusion, because we've had our own civil wars in our country exactly in these types of constellations. So taking that sense and a sense of gratitude, and my way of showing it was through this story and through this book. This is my experience that I had. A reader may take something else from that, but that's how I experienced it. And in seeing these horrors that people are capable of, that people would, I've seen butchers who beat to death little children during the day, and then go home in the evening and have dinner with their kids in the evening, and don't find any irony in it. I talk in this book about towards the end, when I'm catching up with this drug lord in Dubai, and there's a Saudi royal actually who joins our table and starts to drink and have a conversation. And first of all, on the one hand, they're extremely astute in how they analyze the war, because they get it so much. But the Saudi royal, who is a client of this drug lord because he tries to rent young women, girls, from him for his pleasure, it's this weird out-of-body experience where he's talking about these young girls and gives them grades. Talks, this one's a 6, and this one's an 8, and this one cries too much. And then in the next sentence, he talks about his own daughters in the most delicate, loving, gentle way. And for me, it was an out-of-body experience listening to him talk. But for him, there was no such thing. So we're obviously, the human beings are capable of, and I'm not saying because I'm judging him thinking I'm so much better. I just have to understand that as human beings, we seem to be capable of that kind of compartmentalizing. But when we forget how fortunate we are, and when we start to look at the other, right, the other as really always the enemy, then what you end up is these kinds of outcomes. And people who think that that's not possible, even in our country, are really deluding themselves.
Is there, as we're coming up on the hour, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or any final questions from people watching?
No, I don't think from my sense. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. I encourage people to get interested in these things. It doesn't have to be Syria. Syria is just one of those really gruesome crises. I mean, just think ahead. For example, we talk a lot about climate change, not just these days as we should.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's become a tribal discussion. One tribe maybe thinks it's a hoax, and the other tribe thinks it's the end of the world. And there's no way to bridge that, right? Because the facts don't matter anymore. We can't really just look at data and agree on that, even when the science is fairly clear.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not, again, a political discussion, but take climate change as an example. Climate change is affecting not only the whole world. Look at Africa. In the year 2035, over half the population under the age of 20 will live in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and that includes, if you're in your calculation, India and China, because the population growth in Africa is so off the charts higher than anywhere else in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Africa is also being smacked by climate change a lot harder than any other part of the world, which means that we're facing migrations, conservative estimates, of 500 million people over the next decade and a half. Where exactly are those 500 million people going to migrate to? We're talking about Europe. Mm-hmm. We've already seen thousands of people drown in the Mediterranean as they make their way from Niger through Libya, trying to reach Italy's coast, as an example. Or you talked about the Syrian toddler swept up on a Turkish coast, face down on the beach, right? Those are pictures we're going to have to start getting used to. And those mass migrations, and we're talking, again, hundreds of millions of people. Africa will simply be uninhabitable. Large parts of Africa where you're going to have temperatures in the 120s and humidity of 98%, so that our bodies can no longer have a healthy metabolism. It simply will be uninhabitable, as will be parts of the Middle East and the Gulf. Where do those people, hundreds of millions, migrate to? They migrate to Europe, let's say, which is going to have counter reactions to that. Political instability, right? It's no longer a question of right and left. The right and left are going to converge in the fact of trying to deal with that. We have to be ready for those kinds of migrations. They're going to destabilize our societies, as they will in the US, in North America. Mm-hmm. It's not as far away as we think it is. And so if we don't start thinking that through, because what you look at Syria, what you look at Yemen, what you look at Iraq, those types of wars, Afghanistan now, those are the types of instabilities that are going to be in our future unless we're willing to address those challenges, not just as a matter of climate change, but how we deal with populations that aren't our own. It's not a matter of opening our borders or building a wall. It's a matter of dealing with these things intelligently, and also with dealing with these conflicts at their source, so that these huge migration patterns don't occur. And I think it's always high time to deal with it. It's been high time for as long as humanity has existed. So it's not that it's more high time today than it will be tomorrow. But I hope that a reader of the book will also look at it in that kind of a context and develop, and perhaps a certain sense of empathy is well placed to understand that we have, in fact, been, for the most part, pretty fortunate.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I love having these conversations, and I think you've illustrated thoroughly how important conversations and developing understanding are. So thank you for helping that.
Thank you, Bob.
Help us out with that. Proof of Life, it's available in store. It's also available through our website, obpbooks.com. If you're not from the area and you have an independent bookstore around you, tell them to stock it. It's a great book. And I want to do a couple quick plugs for upcoming events that we have. This coming Wednesday, we'll be talking to Alison Kofeld. It's going to be kind of a continuation to a certain extent of our conversation here. Maps Are Lines We Draw, a road trip through Haiti. She really details the here and there and the us and them dynamics that can come up with any sort of international relations topic. With reading this, I finished reading this just before the earthquake in Haiti. So I'm very anxiously awaiting talking to her just to see, she's not in Haiti, but just if anyone that she detailed in the book is how they're doing. But it details over 200 years of history in Haiti, as well as just the experience right on the ground. I learned a lot, and I hope to learn more with the conversation that we'll have with her this coming Wednesday, 7 p.m., August 25th. September 8th, we'll be talking with Andrew Katz, who wrote Vampire Gideon's Suicide Hotline and Halfway House for Orphan Girls, the longest title ever. This is a dark comedy, and we're also partnering with the Suicide Prevention Alliance of Chautauqua County. doing it as a virtual fundraiser for them. Andrew likes to do that whenever he does in-person or virtual events. It's a vampire who doesn't want to be a vampire and set up an unofficial suicide hotline. And I don't have the book because it doesn't come out yet, and my copy that I have is at home, so we'll just do this. Unstitched is an event that we're having Wednesday, September 22nd at 7 p.m. And that is a librarian out of a small town in Vermont that details the opioid epidemic in her community through interviews of members of her community as well as experts, just to get a better understanding for herself. And she put it into a book so people can also get a better understanding of kind of a slice of life that is impacting all of us, but from her specific perspective in Vermont. You can check out all of the events. We've got things booked through November at our website, obpbooks.com, or you can also order Daniel Levin's book. Thank you again, Daniel, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in and engaging with us tonight. Have a nice night.
Thanks.